Well, good evening. Welcome to my study in Ramsbury House in Marlborough. And the weekends on Going to Ground are slightly different from the weekdays when I get out and about, usually. And on Saturdays, I tend to sing a song I've written, and on Sunday, I read you what I've written in reflection on the last week. And these are pieces for my next book, as some of you will know, which hopefully I'm going to be finished by around about next Easter. And it's going to be called English Grounds. And it's a bit of a theological journal, really, about my life and work in Wiltshire, and reflecting particularly on the nation. And you'll have seen those themes about England and the place of the church in national life, and learning from our deep history are evident there, and that's where I'm finding this bit of England to be so rich a theme. Our local MP called Wiltshire recently the source place of England, which was a phrase I really liked. And I think whilst it's easy to make bold claims for the part of the country that you happen to be from, or indeed the country in the world that you happen to be from, I do think there are currents within this bit of the country that hold some clues to our identity, and that's what I'm particularly interested in offering back into the national sphere. So I'm going to read to you this week's piece about that, and it arose out of preaching last weekend, actually, and I then went away and did a bit of work reading up some of the great preachers of the 17th century. I was preaching in a Jacobean pulpit. It was pointed out to me before the service. So a pulpit that was built between, what would that be, 1603 and 1625. And it just made me think of all the thousands of people who had preached from that place, from that very box. And through all of those national crises, times of plague, civil war, empire, all of what's happened, a single person has stood in that box and tried to speak God's truth into those times. So pulpits are like a TARDIS, you know. There are time machines that take you back to all that was said from them. I find them incredibly rich, powerful places to be, and I always encourage clergy to speak from the pulpit. And if I'm speaking in a church, unless it's a really informal service, I'll always try and get into the pulpit. So I probably won't read you all of this because it's a slightly longer piece this week, but it's called Burn Up the Shocks, which is one of my favourite phrases from the scriptures. It's from the book of Judges, where Samson sends out a fox or pair of foxes he ties a burning torch to their tails and sends them off. Actually, dozens of foxes, sends them off into the standing grain, and it lights up the whole field, and it felt a rather apposite image for what these preachers did in the years running up to what's called the English Revolution, the period of the Civil War, and then the Restoration, and then the Protestant succession coming back. Anyway, that's a long preamble, and if you stayed with it this far, thanks for staying on. But Burn Up the Shocks. 62. That's my wife sneezing, by the way, in the background, if you picked that up. It's an allergic day here in Marlborough. 1662 Matins, and the hollow tap of my step up into this Jacobean pulpit. A gorgeous barrel of wood, its stock darkly carved with knots and nuts like an oak tree. Entering the octagon, I'm struck again how each pulpit is a crow's nest on the sea of faith, a lookout for promised land, and on occasion, wreckage that you can cling to when your sermons run aground. How many thousands of clergy have made this ascent before me, I wonder, unsteadily tripping on their robes, fumbling with a scant script, ready and unready for words of fire or folly to tumble out, forgettable tosh, and less often perhaps electric truth that unexpectedly forms a circuit with those present, crackling magically into life. This Wiltshire pulpit was installed at a point when the sermon was at the peak of its force in national propaganda and politics, when it was a dispatch box, a matchbox even, for the tinder of Parliament against Crown and the increasing heat of their friction. When, as John Chandos writes, a surplice was the most dangerous garment a man could wear. Still is, actually. You can trip on them really easily. Don't think he meant like that. The greatest preachers of this incendiary age had a visceral power. Witness this, Lancelot Andrewes, who we talked about actually on Going to Ground a couple of weeks ago, in his sermon from 1615, preached before the king in thanksgiving for deliverance from the gunpowder plot. Andrewes preaches, "Nay, would they make men's bowels fly up and down in the air? Out with those bowels, what should they do in, that have not in them that bowels should have? Would they do it by fire? Into the fire with their bowels, before their faces. Would they make men's bones fly about like chips?" Just as David's prayer, their delight was in cruelty, let it happen to them. They love not mercy, therefore let it be far from them. It staggers me, just as an aside, it staggers me this. Andrewes is the fellow who wrote the Preces Private, the prayer book that I read from a little while ago on Going to Ground. Beautiful, pious book of devotions. And yet here he is, preaching about, innards and damning those who have caused this event. It's a curious thing that one immediately considers, automatically rather, considers devout people to be people of great peace publicly, but some of them weren't. And Andrewes was a legend. I mean, he is one of the great preachers of the age, but he could set things alight too. This was the era when a special statute had to be raised to punish fighting in church. He who struck the first blow with a naked weapon should lose his ears, or, if he wants ears, as the statute says, which is a rather lovely phrase, be branded on the face. When even a royalist archbishop like James Usher could preach on the theme, "The natural man is a dead man," by reminding his white-knuckled congregants that the greatest man that lives cannot shield himself from a covering of worms, and dwelling with terrible care on the behaviours meriting eternal torment, and the filthy rabble, as he put it, already headed there. Eternity was, in the 17th century, a deeply politicised time frame, and increasingly so as preachers amplified the monarch's claim to divine right in earthly governance, and ecclesiastical polity became, under William Laud, a vital means of retaining social order. In his sermon, A Kingdom Melting, from the pivotal year of 1625, Laud presciently warns that unless the king trust and endear his people, and they likewise honour and obey their king, then, in some degree or other, there will be liquefactio terra, a melting or a waste in both church and state, a melting of the land, of the terrain. Amazing. For many Puritans, of course, this was anathema, yet even their departure from the molten island was imbued with a deep and regretful patriotism, as in Thomas Hooker's sermon of farewell to England, before leaving to found the colony of Connecticut. Citing Christ weeping over Jerusalem, he mourns, God is going, his glory is departing. England hath seen her best days, and now evil days are befalling us. God is packing up his gospel. One is bound to draw parallels with our own time, incomprehensibly, outlandishly different, though the prologue to the English Revolution seems to us now. Yet the sense of impending chaos, a teetering desire to leave and begin again, our indignation, fear and frantic slicing of righteous from unrighteous, all these we recognize, do we not? As through a glass darkly. So what place for the pulpit now, without the need to delay damnation, and when even those who believe in the eternal kind seem less inclined to give God's judgment a truly human face? Excuse me, at least the graphic hell of the 17th century felt physical, sensual, so close that we might smell it smouldering. I well recall Ralph Holbrook, my professor of early modern history, comparing these firebrands unfavourably to, as he put it, the kind of milk and water preaching that we hear nowadays, and contending, to his surprise, that this was not so, and feeling my own vocation begin to stir. It was after the Restoration that sermons settled back into a more domestic tone, and Pepys could flit from pulpit to pulpit, taking them in as if window displays. Then those Puritans who had lately and so briefly burned up the shocks experienced their own exile, impotent and sightless, like Samson, Milton's Samson. Bless you. Few public figures could survive the veering pandemonium of that era, although arguably the most golden-mouthed of them all managed to do so, Lord's protégé, Jeremy Taylor. Having been allowed to spend the Protectorate in Wales, far from Westminster, he preached with an unsurpassed lyricism, so that even his sinners went singing to his graves. Of the Spirit of Grace, a sermon from 1651, he brings a Christ-like lightness to the restrictions of discipleship. He writes, "And as no one will complain that their temples are restrained and their head is prisoner when it's encircled by a crown, so when the Son of God hath made us free and hath only subjected us to the service and dominion of the Spirit, we are as free as princes within the circles of their diadem. Our chains are bracelets." Isn't that beautiful? Taylor's facility was to make godliness winsome and as desirable as worldly excess. It's the small pleasures, he says, that are the most delicious. The feeling of silk, he writes, or the handling of a melon, or a mole's skin. Not sure when you can actually handle a mole's skin. Such is the kind of moderation we might die for. In our own disjointed times, likewise prone to fanatical extremes, Taylor can still coax us towards virtue. And though it seems unlikely the pulpit could regain its sentinel role in public affairs, we pressingly need those who can spy out the place to come and, furthermore, describe that land vividly enough for others to reach out from the pew and grasp its shoreline. Preachers, in other words, who desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. God bless you, friends, as you go to ground.